Our reading this morning is by Ruben Alves. He is a Brazilian liberation theologian, and this is a poem in his book, Tomorrow's Child. What is hope? It is a presentiment that imagination is more real and reality less real than it looks. It is a hunch that the overwhelming brutality of facts that oppress and repress is not the last word. It is a suspicion that reality is more complex than realism wants us to believe, and that the frontiers of the possible are not determined by the limits of the actual, and that in a miraculous and unexpected way, life is preparing the creative events which will open the way to freedom and resurrection. The two, suffering and hope, live from each other. Suffering without hope produces resentment and despair. Hope without suffering creates illusions, naivety, and drunkenness. Let us plant dates, even though those who plant them will never eat them. We must live by the love of what we will never see. This is the secret discipline. It is a refusal to let the creative act be dissolved in immediate sense experience, and a stubborn commitment to the future of our grandchildren. Such disciplined love is what has given prophets, revolutionaries, and saints the courage to die for the future they envisaged. They make their own bodies the seed of their highest hope. I think for many of us right now, in spite of the sunshine, in spite of our joys, the world may be a little too much with us. For those of us who care deeply about climate, about peace, about overturning hierarchies and oppressions, for those of us who are passionate about building community or about anything at all, the world puts the pressure on. Whatever your cause, whatever you are committed to in this world, your work may be wearing you down right now. And I think I'm probably not alone in this room when I say that I tend to take the weight of the world upon my shoulders. I tend to believe that I ought to be doing more, so much more, and that's true, because there is always more to be done. And some of it may well need to be done by me. And so many of us struggle on, unable to see the difference we make in the world we care so deeply about. That is exhausting. And that exhaustion can lead to cynicism. And cynicism is corrosive. It is in many ways a mask for pain and despair. And it encourages us to cease striving because it doesn't matter anyway. Cynicism encourages us to look on the world and on others with suspicion. It encourages us to assume that we are powerless. Cynicism claims to be a counterpoint to the hubris that convinces us that we must have control, that we must do all the right things, and we must change the world. But cynicism does not actually oppose that. It's simply the end of that line of thought. Cynicism is the fall from pride. And so I see a clear trajectory for me from pride, I can and I must do all the things, to despair, that what I do does not matter. And what's interesting about this is that both of those things are kind of assuming that I am the center of the universe. Both of them assume that things in this world are certain. And both of these perspectives assume that I am wise enough and far-seeing enough to fully understand the certain things in this world. And these are simply not true things. And this is a narrative that we have seen play out in the big picture form over the course of our own religious history. Our liberal religious forebears believed in progress, and I do mean believed. It was very much integral to their faith. Prior versions of our faith were just as committed as we are today to bringing about a new world, and they believed that it was inevitable, the natural unfolding of history. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with abolitionist Theodore Parker's famous statement, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I can see, I am sure it bends towards justice. Things refuse to be mismanaged long." Over the following decades, this belief in the unfolding divine will solidified. And again, our forebears came to believe that progress was inevitable. The new sciences would lead us. Sociology and psychology would show us the way. We would measure society's flaws and fix them and redeem ourselves. The great universalist Clarence Skinner called for a religion that not only woke our spirits, but that included a constructive working program, one that would transform this old earth into the kingdom of heaven. And he too called this universalism inevitable, part of the unity that was sweeping the world. The Social Implications of Universalism, his book, was published in 1915 when unity was not, in fact, sweeping the world. And so I don't know the timeline, when he wrote it, when he submitted it to Skinner Press, but I have to assume that it was written before shots were fired in 1914. Skinner was a pacifist and an idealist, so maybe he believed those early skirmishes would come to nothing. After this work was written, the world saw the brutality of trench warfare and violence on a scale not previously understood. The world saw a flu epidemic. The world saw the collapse of empires, but not into peace, but disorder. And 2 decades later, the world would see still worse, coming to understand the most terrible things that human beings can do to one another. No planet that has seen the atomic bomb can pretend that progress is inevitable. And we may, in fact, wonder if progress is even possible. Towards the end of his life, Skinner's language and arguments changed, acknowledging that the work of progress had to be done by human hands and was not at all inevitable. And I think most of us today, when we think of that Theodore Parker quote, we understand that it is we who bend the arc. Many of Skinner's fellow travelers adopted a harder realism in the years following world wars. And I'm thinking specifically of theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr, who had also been a pacifist and a socialist, but who ultimately rejected the possibility of human perfection and called for a renewal of realism. But unlike Niebuhr, Skinner never relinquished a sense of possibility. He simply relinquished a sense of certainty. And I think, to me, this is the difference between optimism and hope. To believe that everything is going to turn out all right and that progress is inevitable, that's optimism. To be uncertain, to not know, but to believe that there is meaning and that we can make meaning even if we do not know the outcome, that feels like hope to me. And it is that hope that moves us to shape the arc of history ourselves, rather than having faith that it will shape itself without our intervention. Nancy MacDonald Ladd is a UU minister in Maryland, and several years ago she wrote a book, After the Good News, Progressive Faith Beyond Optimism. And her work is a call to leaning into uncertainty and ambiguity and not knowing. And in her book, she's writing out of the ache she feels when she encounters our utopian heritage and the undercurrents that still linger. The ache she feels at how insufficient that kind of utopianism can be in the face of the work that she feels called to do. And she says that optimism tells a preordained narrative. It's an assertion that the scales have already been tipped towards triumph. Optimism is always busy absolving somebody. Hope is different, the exact opposite of certainty. It does not presume an outcome for good or for ill. It is the possibility, though not the inevitability, of a better way. And she observes that much of her own angst and the angst she occasionally senses in Unitarian Universalism is in that tension between the idealism we hold and the boots on the ground, and in the unspoken belief that we ought to be able to follow this preordained narrative, and that narrative slams up against the reality of uncertainty and ambiguity. Because we cannot ever assume that our actions will yield immediate visible results. Believing that we have control over outcomes is a fragile thing, a kind of optimism that is easily wounded or broken. White feminist ethicist Sharon Welch calls this an ethic of control and reminds us that it is too fragile to face the world as it really is. Welch calls us instead to an ethic of risk, to being willing to engage with the world without certainty, without control, to push ourselves beyond comfort and expectations, and to a place without security or action plans or mile markers. And I see myself, I hear myself in Welch's words, and I recognize that version of myself that is perfectionist, that desires a neat and tidy relationship between action and outcome. I'm definitely a perfectionist. I want to do everything right the first time. I want to never make a mistake. I want to have everything I say or do be just right. And that is a natural human thing to desire. Of course, we would like to be splendid and worthy of admiration, but the problem is that this is pride and hubris. And deep down, I know that to be true, which leads me to the painful side of perfectionism, which is paralysis. And perhaps this is familiar to some of you who swim in the same cultural waters that I do. It's a self-centered way of thought, and I can say that since I'm talking about myself. When I'm anxious and worried about getting it right, whether that turns into action or not, either way, I'm thinking about me and my own feelings, not other people and not the work in front of me. To return to Nancy MacDonald Ladd, underneath the will to mutuality, there is a will to perfection, a will to be personally justified, a will to be effective, and in the end, through all our carefully calibrated strategies, a will to win the game that was never meant to be a game at all. There is an idolatry of expectation that drives us in the liberal churches to imagine that the dismantling of oppression was ever achievable through the limited mechanism of our own personal efforts. Only hubris tells us that social change can be articulated on a spreadsheet, and our anti-oppressive credentials can be listed on a flyer. And this urge to perfection, this longing for control is what the broader American culture says that I should want and is the place it says I should act from. The world tries to tell me that, of course, my actions have observable outcomes and I can feel good about my accomplishments. And the problem, of course, is that it doesn't work that way, and that it is easy to feel defeated and to feel despair, because there are 1,000 ways for our work to disappoint us. Legislation will be watered down, reforms will fail, movements will falter. Attaching ourselves to outcomes and timelines will only ever lead to disappointment. And knowing that we will fail at some things must not be a reason to withdraw. Acceptance of reality must be our beginning point and not our ending point. Baptist minister Miguel de la Torre has called for a theology of hopelessness, and the way he uses the word hope is the way I've been talking about optimism. He is demanding that we all acknowledge the reality of the world we live in and the tragedy of human life. But he demands that we do so without withdrawal. He asks that we stand between optimism and despair, for both of those lead to inaction. And he calls for us to find the place where we are fueled to act, this in-between place, a place of uncertainty and not knowing. This is a place where we cannot know ultimate outcomes and where we may not experience denial or numbness. It is a place where we understand that change may be possible. We simply understand that it is not given to us to know precisely how and precisely why. Uncertainty and possibility are simultaneous here. Liberation theology is an awkward fit for someone who is not a monotheist. But I do not think that liberal optimism will lead to liberation. There is something very powerful in the idea that the divine is not future perfection, a future kingdom of God, but is instead a God who chooses to dwell among human beings in our pain and uncertainty. It's a different kind of hope, a hope without outcome, but a hope that assures us that the holy is here and now, and that it is worth acting. I hope I'm not misusing de la Torre's language to say that I distinguish between the passive hope of optimism and the engaged hope that leads to action. This active hope, the impetus to engage with the world around us, does not allow us to excuse ourselves. It makes demands of us. It requires commitment. And it makes those demands right in the middle of ambiguity and uncertainty. De la Torre is writing about defiance in the face of despair because there is nothing left to lose, and so perhaps he is also distinguishing between a passive and an active form of despair. But I do truly think that in order to act at all, one must have some room to think our action will have meaning. It may or may not make immediate change. I may or may not have that power or the ability to see the outcome. But it has meaning to do it anyway. To acknowledge the world as it is, to accept reality and not to turn away. Hope is not waiting for something to change, but fuel to make change. By relinquishing control and the idea of the perfect outcome, by turning instead to solidarity and openness to possibility, hope can be a desire and a practice, and not an impossible dream. And this is what church is for. Not only can church sustain our spirits in the way I talked about last week, not only can church be a community to one another, church is a place of vision and dreaming, a place to imagine, and a place to make meaning around our lives, even amid uncertainty. And the culture we move through does not call us to that kind of active hope. So to choose to live from that place is to resist the siren songs of cynicism or utopianism, to lean into action without certainty, to simply do the next right thing is to act from whatever power we do have, to live in the world so that it moves us, rather than pushing us into despair, to live in the world as active participants rather than closing ourselves off. This is fueled by hope, an active hope, one that will not allow us to excuse ourselves, but one that calls us into deeper engagement with the world and a deeper commitment to building this world into something more. And so I close this morning with the words of Dorothy Day. People say, what is the sense of our small effort? They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. A pebble cast into a pond causes ripples that spread in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, words, and deeds is like that. No one has a right to sit down and feel hopeless. There is too much work to do.